I have two very different projects going on right now. After my last video, I said how I struggle really getting the proper exposure without a ton of noise on the Pyxis at the higher base ISO values. And you guys were awesome and broke it down for me in the comments. I am a Sony shooter, so when I think dual ISO, I think 800 and 12,800, and that's it. To all of my Sony shooter friends, Blackmagic advertises the dual base ISO of the Pyxis to be 400 and 3200. But really there are two ranges of ISO values. There are not only two that you should be using, but understanding the range will allow you to get better results out of this camera. Range 1 is 100 to 1000. Range 2 is 1250 to 12,600. 400 and 3200 happen to be the sweet spot that retains the most highlight and shadow information on both of the ISO ranges. However, at 3200, I was getting way more noise than I thought I should be in the image, and I thought I was doing something wrong. Again, to reiterate, this camera is shooting RAW. There is no in-camera noise reduction that's happening like if you're internally recording here. So my mistake was thinking that I had to shoot at 3200 and then always denoise it. As a Sony shooter, you can choose your base ISO and you have to choose your exposure index, your EI value, to adjust your highlight and shadow information. Blackmagic, however, gives you the native 400 and 3200 based on equal highlight and shadow dynamic range, not based on noise. So the Pyxis's cleanest base ISO is 100 and 1250, but those are definitely favoring shadow information, and there isn't a lot of highlight latitude at the base ISOs. As you increase your ISO from 100 or 1250, you'll increase the gain and start to favor the highlights, but you will introduce more noise. This is more apparent in the second range of ISO values. This makes so much more sense to me, and thank you guys for explaining it to me like this. It's so wild that I've used Sony cameras for so long. I've forgotten how normal cameras actually expose, and my habits are so bad that I think all cameras are using Sony's Cine EI way of doing this. To illustrate this, I compared a few different ISO values at the different ISO ranges. But before we get into those test results, I want to take a quick second to thank today's video sponsor, Artlist. Artlist has over 400,000 high-quality assets available for you to use in your personal and commercial work. Their tools make it easy to find the exact song you need. Their filters make it easy to choose a genre and refine your results with mood keywords. You can narrow down the music by which instruments are used, if you want vocals or not, or adjusting the BPM. They also have playlists that help give you some inspiration from different creators, moods, or types of videos. Artlist also has a new LUTs section. My favorite part about this is that they have multiple different source clips that you can apply the LUT to, so you can see how it will look in a dark scene or a bright scene or more. Artlist also has a new feature called Artboards. Artboards uses AI to suggest content from within the Artlist catalog of assets for you to use in your projects based on what your project needs. Start by telling the artboard what your project is about and then click generate. Artlist will then generate an artboard that suggests music, sound effects, and footage for your project. You can add the assets to the board to get initial feedback or inspiration for shots that you want to shoot, or even use these in your final deliverables. You can share your artboards with your client and crew, and when they click your link, they will be brought to a page where they can see all of your ideas for your project. They can listen to the sound effects and music that you've added to the board and see the footage that you've added, and they don't need to have an account to do so. I tested this in an incognito tab, and I was able to browse all the assets without logging in. But if you do want to download the actual assets and use them, you will need an active Artlist subscription. If you'd like to check that out, Artlist is offering 2 free months if you use the link in my description. Thank you, Artlist, for sponsoring this video. When it came to exposing the Pyxis, here is what I learned based on those tests. In controlled lighting, shooting at ISO 400 is your best bet. Set your camera and adjust your lights so you get an even amount of highlight and shadow information. However, if you're shooting a dark and moody scene and you have a lot of detail in your shadows, decrease your ISO towards 100. if you want to favor the highlights and it's a brighter scene, you'll need to apply some noise reduction the closer you get to that higher end of 1000, but you will be favoring the highlight data there. So I found choosing 400 in controlled lighting was my best bet here. When it comes to uncontrolled or low light situations, this is where things got a little bit spicier. Sticking to the different ranges, the higher range starting at 1250 in low light will give you the most dynamic range in the shadows while keeping the noise down as well. You'll have not a whole lot of room to work in the highlights, but if you're in a mostly dark scene, this might actually be okay. Increasing to 2000 or 2500 could help you have more room to work with in the highlights, but you will need to apply a little bit of noise reduction and resolve. 3200 and above, this is when you're definitely going to have to apply a little bit more aggressive noise reduction in post, and your results may vary here. So if you're shooting in a low light situation, I would definitely do some tests first. Unfortunately, noise reduction is pretty hard on your computer. You have to have a pretty nice machine to view your image in full res if you will be applying noise reduction here. You can use proxies, but in my experience, if I was toggling proxies on and off while I was grading, it was a little difficult to get a full read on the footage. If I was, grading 420 8-bit proxy footage, they could get a little bit blocky if I was making big exposure or color adjustments while applying the noise reduction. I found the danger zone of the Pyxis is when you are trying to adjust the ISO to raise the exposure of your scene. This is where I ran into a lot of trouble. In run and gun conditions, this is where it's burned me the most for sure. I'm mostly using the Arls on my Pyxis, so at T1.4 I can get a pretty low light, but I'm then forced into a razor thin depth of field at that point. It's a bit of a trade-off, but it's one I've been willing to make with the Pyxis. For exposing my Sony cameras, I would typically choose an ISO value, 1 of 2, and then shift my EI value until I got where I wanted to. I found myself typically shooting 1 or 1.5 stops under my EI value or my ISO value. And that really gave me the cleanest shadows, and the post-production is pretty straightforward. Just lower the exposure. This is gonna sound crazy if you're familiar with other systems, but it wasn't out of the ordinary for me to film at 12,800 and either use ND or stop down the lens to get the correct exposure with my Sony cameras. I have more Pyxis stuff coming in the future. I mostly make Sony videos, but I have been testing out this Pyxis, and I don't know if maybe I'll be selling one of my Sony cameras to keep this Pyxis. I've been really loving the 6K open gate, and the more I work with B-RAW, I actually really like it. Maybe that's a whole nother conversation for a different video, but thank you guys for sticking around to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.